Hey, welcome to session 4 on marriage and family. And we're going to look a little bit about some of the overall principles of really a healthy marriage, especially from a biblical viewpoint. And I've come up with, let me see, I have to count them here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points. So it's got to be perfect. Well, it's maybe not perfect, but anyway, my thoughts on 7 key things to consider if you're going to have an effective marriage. Now again, when I say effective, I don't mean perfect. There's no such animal as a perfect marriage. A perfect marriage would require 2 perfect people. That happened once. It was in the garden, and that didn't even work out. So anyway, so we know there's no such animal as a perfect marriage. A healthy marriage, an effective marriage, I believe that is quite possible, and certainly it is the will of God for each of us. But let me just kind of lay out a few points that I think have been helpful. And again, when you're counseling people, you kind of want to listen for these characteristics, if you will. You want to try and ascertain, we'll go through each one, but how they're doing in these key areas. The first one I have is called simply commitment or covenant. So one of the questions that you want to make sure you can answer as a counselor, as you're listening to them tell their story or battle through whatever they're struggling with, is this couple really committed? And one of the things that you can find is a couple that's willing to fight a little bit is probably invested in the relationship. One of the worst things that can happen is when you find that one or the other partner is completely disengaged. As they're not interested in fighting. Now that's not always the case. Like I think I shared my story about my mom and my dad. They fought like crazy. I was going to say like cats and dogs, but they usually get along. My parents, they were very immature when they got married, etc. And so, about almost, I think it was right about 50 years into their marriage, they were coming back from a restaurant. And my mom was kind of picking at my dad about his driving and a few other things, and he wasn't responding. And finally, my mom turned to him and said, "Why don't you fight with me anymore?" And my dad looked at her and says, "Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't fought with you for the last year." She said, "Oh, no, I noticed. How come you don't fight with me anymore?" And he said, "Well, I'm tired of fighting." She said, "Well, then I guess I won't fight either." And they stopped. I wish they could have figured that one out about 50 years before, but anyway, at least they got to it. An engaged relationship, sometimes there's going to be friction and conflict, etc. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad or an ineffective relationship. But one of the things you have to determine is how really covenantally committed are they. We do know that when you have a couple and one or both have come from a divorce family system, where their parents divorce becomes more of an option in their thinking. Those that have come from an intact family, mom and dad may have fought and been crazy, but nonetheless they stayed together somehow, they're less likely to see divorce as an option. And so that's something you want to determine, because really healthy marriages are committed to each other. They have a covenant. It's beyond a contract. We didn't, whether made it to the courthouse or not, the key thing is that they're committed and in a covenant relationship. The vows that they made to one another when they got married, although they may need to update them, and I recommend that, but they were solid. They absolutely believe that this relationship that we're entering into together is, again, one man, one woman, one lifetime. The second principle that I look for and listen for is love and respect. Love and respect. Is there? We do know that according to Ephesians chapter 5 that husbands are to love their wives and the wives are supposed to respect their husband. Now, honestly, wives need to love their husbands and husbands need to respect their wives. So it's more of the emphasis I think Paul was giving, but both are important in a healthy relationship, love and respect. Is there, that's why I usually will ask questions in the beginning. Tell me how you met. what was the early days like for them. And if you kind of see this, a softening and a bit of a spark, if you will, in their eyes, there's still some definite romantic, at least, love. There's still some interest in each other. It's when the heart has become cold that it's very difficult. Sometimes you got to bury something before you can get it back to life, because the only hope for it is resurrection. But one of the things you're looking for is there genuine love, and is there respect, and how is that expressed? It may not be expressed clearly. Is it asked for? In other words, is a lot of the fight is, you don't love me. If you love me, you would do this for me. Is the lack of respect because I don't trust that you're going to actually try and take care of me like you promised you would. So looking for some of the underlying issues, but is there at least some foundation of love and respect? Because in healthy marriages, effective marriages, there is that foundation of love and respect. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, what does that mean? Well, Christ loved the church agape, sacrificially. How are we to love our wives? Well, sacrificially. Well, what sacrifices does the man make for his spouse? And what you often find is not much or not at all. If that's the case, that's probably an issue. How can you kind of get that back into the relationship or introduce it to the relationship if it's never been there? Does the wife show respect to her husband? Does she speak well of him? Or is he, the constant butt of jokes and sarcasm? When he asks for something, hey honey, would you mind picking me up, a Diet Coke at the store, and out of the 15 things that she buys, the one thing she forgets is the Diet Coke. You want to listen for and look for those kinds of things. The third thing that's obviously very important is communication. And communication is happening all the time. We are always communicating. Even silence is a form of communication. There's body language, which we, as counselors, you're looking at body language. Sometimes people fold their arms not because they're resistant. Sometimes they're just cold, or maybe it just makes them feel more comfortable. But sometimes it is resistance, and sometimes it is, I don't want you to get close to me. I want to protect myself from you. So body language can be important. You have to kind of suss it out to see whether it is or not. But the ability to communicate is really important. And many couples struggle in communicating their wants, their needs, their hurts, etc. And so that's a big part of the counseling process, is facilitate, not communicating necessarily for them, but more communicating with them and facilitating their communication with one another. Learning to speak, yes, and learning to listen. That's why I use the phrase, that my mom used to teach me all the time, Stan, there's a reason why God created you with 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you'll listen twice as much as you talk. Certainly that's true, or it should be true in the counseling process. We should do a lot less teaching, talking, and a lot more listening and reflecting. That's part of our responsibility and our role. But in a similar way, you'll find that one or the other of the couple usually is the good talker, not necessarily a good communicator, but a good talker. The other one pretends to listen or is an avoider. And so you want to help them to actually facilitate talking about their hurts, their wounds, their needs, their desires, their wishes, etc., and help them then to communicate in a loving and respecting way to one another. So communication is very important. Vision, I think, is also important. That is, do they have only short-term vision, or do they have a long-term vision? The time in the counseling office, is this kind of more of a, I need to get the car in for maintenance? Or is this a total overhaul? And are we looking long term? We want to keep this vehicle forever, or are we looking to trade it in on a new model? And that's part of what you're listening for. Is one or the other already, as it were, out the door? Healthy couples, effective marriages, they have a long-term vision and they talk about it. And it's not just about retirement. It's about, the plans and design that they have for their life. Do they have one? Do they have a real vision for the future? Do they have a purpose for their marriage beyond just making each other miserable? One would hope. Does that include children or not? And, where are they going with their life, their vision, their purpose? Do they have a plan to actually achieve some of the goals and dreams that they have? Because, again, in the very present, they may be struggling, but if they've had a relatively healthy past, they can build then toward a very healthy future. But it requires a plan, and that's part of the counseling process, is to help them with the plan, and then also to teach them how to learn to do their own review, because you're not going to be there forever with them. You want to help them to be able to periodically and put in place, if you will, a system to help them to be able to stop and periodically evaluate, how are we doing? Are we working toward our goals? Are we treating each other with love and respect? Are we helping to strengthen our covenant? Have we said or done something to violate our covenant with each other, to break trust? If so, we need to pray and seek forgiveness. Again, healthy relationships are kind of built on these foundation stones. Now, again, for a Christian family, and most of you will be dealing with Christian families, at least have a profession of faith. They may not be very strong believers or mature believers, but most will be believers. And so the scriptures that we've already talked about are very important. But let me just review, again, primarily some of the key scriptures. I mean, you might want to look these up on your own. There's 1 Peter 3, 1 through 12, Colossians 3, 18 to 21. Don't necessarily speak specifically about marriage, but they do talk a bit about relationships and the importance of them and identity, and that's all a big part of the counseling process. But it's primarily in Ephesians chapter 5, and it's verses, I like to start in verses 1 and 2, and then verse 22, and then the rest of the chapter up through chapter 6, verse 4, really talks about marriage and family. Now, one of the things that you do when you're counseling marriages is you have to kind of get them off the blame game for a season and stop to look at some principles, hopefully, of married life or life in general. And so I like using Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1, 2, because it talks about be imitators of Christ as beloved children and walk in love. And it speaks about the sacrifice, if you will, of walking in love and of imitating Christ. So, because I've found, when I hear a husband say to the wife, "You're such a shrew," or "I can't stand you," or "You drive me crazy." I said, now, do these really sound similar to the words that Christ might share? I do remember a guy told me that there was a prophetic word once. This was kind of strange, but this prophet came up to this woman and said to her, "Thus saith the Lord, thou art a dingbat, saith God, thou art a dingbat." And the husband stood up and said, "I told you you were a dingbat. Even God believes you are." Well, I'm not sure that was a true prophecy, but anyway, it was kind of an interesting story. But look, when husbands and wives, when they berate each other, etc., they're obviously not imitating Christ. They're not walking in love. In verse 22, it talks about, in chapter 5, submit one to another, or there's a certain level of mutual submission that has to happen in a healthy, effective marriage. Look, men are not necessarily good at all things, quote unquote, masculine, and women are not good at all things, quote unquote, feminine. Really, especially nowadays, there's a lot of overlap in roles and function, etc., most of which needs to be, in a healthy marriage, negotiated. Who's going to do what and who's going to do it when, and you kind of build life together. But it starts by a sense of mutual submission. In other words, I want to figure out some way to love you and to bless you, and that your partner hopefully has a similar attitude that says, I want to find out ways that I can love you and bless you. I'm not trying to get something from you. I'm trying to give something to you. Now, in a mature relationship, that is more of the attitude. Again, not every marriage. In fact, probably most of the marriage problems that you'll face selfishness and pride are big parts of it. That is, I believe I'm right because I am whoever I am, male or female. It's all about me. You're not meeting my needs. If you really loved me, you would, and you can fill in the blank. So one of the things you listen for is not so much is there selfishness, there's always selfishness because we're human and we all miss the mark. But the question is, how entrenched are they? How rigid are they in their perception of their roles, etc.? Because traditional roles, which a lot of people would love to get back to, father knows best and leave it to beaver, those days are way, way long gone. Influences of all kinds have caused that to happen. So, but the principles, again, that you find in the rest of Ephesians and into, chapter 6 are, husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Basically, that they're set aside for them, they're cleansed, and they've been made a part of their family. Really, it's a beautiful presentation, if you will. Christ gave himself and did so that it might cleanse us, separate us unto himself. And one of the things I look for in a healthy marriage is there this sense that we really are a couple, and we're struggling right now. We got some issues in our lives. We've got some problems we're having to deal with, but we are a couple, and we want to cover each other, protect each other. And the husband is to nourish and to cherish and to protect, to preserve. And it's really more than just provide and protect. I mean, that's traditionally what we've thought. So, when the wife complains about something going wrong at home, I'm out working. And if someone attacks you, I'll shoot them. So that's my job. But the plumbing, the yard, other things, no. I mean, to nourish, to care goes far beyond just the simple role of provide and protect. For the wife, it's more than just, again, taking care of needs. But overall, again, we know that the husband and the wife is the primary relationship in terms of marriage and family. It's not the children, it's not the family dog, it's not mom and dad. Again, leave, cleave, become one. Those are all key. The wife then is to respect the husband. The husband is to love the wife. The children are to obey. Why? Because as I told my kids when they were young, remember what the Bible says, to obey is better than being sacrificed. I brought you in, I'll take you out. Okay, we know that that's not exactly the way the scripture reads, and once they learned to read it themselves, they were kind of mad at me for a while. But anyway, to obey is really important. That's all they need to know. Now, again, that's up until about age 12. We'll talk about that in another session. So the overall principles that we're working from is husbands, love your wives, wives, respect the husband, and then there's more than just a husband-wife responsibility in taking care of your own kids, but there's also a community responsibility to demonstrate healthy, loving relationship. And so we're going to go more deeply into some of these principles as we go through the course. In our next session, we're going to focus our attention primarily on dysfunctional families. Now, I'm not doing this so that you can feel guilty and sad about your own life. I'm doing this so that you can understand some of what you're going to be dealing with most likely. The root of it is an inadequate leave, an inadequate cleave, an inadequate one flesh. Too much of focus on control in the home, enmity, fighting, too much focus on work in my own career, all of which is discussed, if you will, in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 and other passages. We'll look more at that, about dysfunctional families and how to deal with them in our next session.